Favors, far more than cash, are the lifeblood of the underworld. When a man is the head of the Jason syndicate, men beg him for their lives, their debts, their very souls, but nobody ever asks him to babysit. When Senator Henry Caldwell, a man drowning in $1 million debt and surrounded by invisible enemies, slid a photograph across Arthur Jason's mahogany desk and asked, "Could you accompany my daughter today?" Arthur should have put a bullet in his knee for the insult. Instead, he looked at the photograph. That single, hesitant request didn't just alter his weekend, it dismantled his empire, triggered a gang war, and rewrote the definition of a monster. Arthur Jason did not entertain guests in the morning. The penthouse office overlooking the gray, churning waters of the East River was a sanctuary of silence, punctuated only by the ticking of a 19th century grandfather clock. Arthur was 34, a man carved from cold marble and old blood. He had inherited the syndicate from his father at 22, and in 12 years, he had transformed a messy, violent mob into a sleek, corporate phantom. He wore bespoke Italian suits, spoke softly, and killed without a flinch. But today, the silence was broken by the trembling hands of Senator Henry Caldwell. Henry was a ghost of the man who had confidently taken the podium during the last election cycle. His skin was the color of old parchment, and the scotch in his crystal glass shook violently. Henry owed the Jason family $3 million a debt accrued through a lethal cocktail of gambling, blackmail, and desperate campaign financing. "You understand, Henry, that my patience is not a renewable resource," Arthur said, his voice a low, smooth baritone. He didn't look at the senator. Instead, he carefully clipped the end of a Cohiba cigar. "Arthur, please. I have the money. I have the offshore accounts routing through the Caymans as we speak. By Monday, you'll have every cent, plus the 20% interest," Henry stammered, wiping a bead of sweat from his temple. "Monday is a lifetime away," Arthur replied, striking a match. He let the flame dance for a moment before lighting the cigar. "And in my world, people have a habit of dying before Monday." Henry leaned forward, his eyes wide with a terrifying, primal panic. "That's exactly why I'm here. It's not just your money, Arthur. The Ricci family. They know about the zoning laws I blocked for their waterfront casinos. They know I'm tied to you. They sent a message last night." Arthur's sharp gaze finally locked onto the older man. "A message? My driver—" Henry swallowed hard. "They found him in the trunk of my town car. Arthur, they are going to make a move. I am going to an underground safe house managed by the feds until the money clears and I can leverage my way out of this. But I can't take her with me." Henry reached into the breast pocket of his tailored jacket and pulled out a small, glossy photograph, sliding it across the polished mahogany desk. Arthur looked down. The woman in the photo had a mess of chestnut hair pinned up carelessly with a tortoiseshell clip. She was laughing, looking over her shoulder at the camera, wearing a paint-splattered apron. Her eyes were a striking, piercing hazel. "Elizabeth," Henry whispered, his voice cracking. "My daughter." "I know who she is," Arthur said coldly. "She works at the Guggenheim. Art restoration. Keeps her head down. Doesn't know her father is a degenerate gambler who sleeps with the wolves. She thinks I'm attending a conference in Geneva this weekend," Henry pleaded. "Tonight is the annual Metropolitan Art Gala. It's the biggest night of her career. She's unveiling a restored Caravaggio. If the Rickus want to get to me, to force my hand before I disappear, they will take her. My private security is compromised. I don't know who is on Ricky's payroll." Arthur leaned back, exhaling a plume of blue smoke. "And what does this have to do with me, Henry? I am not a bodyguard. If she dies, your debt transfers to your estate. I get paid either way." Henry dropped his head into his hands. "Because 40 years ago, my father hid yours in our basement when the feds raided Little Italy. He took a perjury charge to keep your father out of a federal penitentiary. I have never invoked the old debt, Arthur. Never. But I am cashing it in now." The room grew deadly silent. In the syndicate, the old laws were sacred. A blood debt from the previous generation was a heavy chain. Arthur stared at the desperate man, feeling a rare flicker of annoyance, mingled with a begrudging respect for the invocation of the old code. "Could you accompany my daughter today?" Henry looked up, tears finally spilling over his lashes. "Just for tonight. Be her shadow. She thinks you are a private benefactor. I arranged to escort her since her fiancé is out of town. Just get her through the gala, and keep her alive until Sunday morning. My men will have relocated her by then. Arthur looked at the photograph again. There was something irritatingly pure about her smile. It offended the darkness he lived in. One night, Arthur said softly, putting the cigar down. If she proves difficult, I will lock her in a vault until Sunday. And Henry? Yes. If my money isn't in my accounts by Monday at noon, I will hunt you down myself, and no old debts will save you. Elizabeth Caldwell's studio smelled of turpentine, old dust, and beeswax. Arthur stood in the doorway, his broad shoulders practically filling the frame, watching her work. She was hunched over a canvas, a magnifying glass strapped to her forehead, meticulously dabbing a microscopic amount of solvent onto a darkened patch of a Renaissance canvas. She wasn't expecting him for another hour. He had arrived early to secure the perimeter, having already stationed 2 of his best men, Leo and Dominic, at the street-level exits. You're breathing too loudly, Elizabeth said suddenly, not looking up from her work. It's distracting. Arthur raised an eyebrow. Most people stopped breathing entirely when he walked into a room. My apologies, Miss Caldwell. I didn't realize respiration was prohibited in the presence of genius. Elizabeth finally stopped, pulled the magnifying loupe off her forehead, and turned around. Up close, without the barrier of a photograph, she was striking. Not conventionally flawless, but sharp, observant, and vibrating with an intense, nervous energy. She wiped her hands on a rag and looked him up and down. Arthur was dressed impeccably in a charcoal 3-piece suit, a crisp white shirt, and a dark silk tie. The tailoring hid the holster of his Sig Sauer P 226 perfectly. You must be Arthur Jasson, she said, her tone laced with a distinct layer of skepticism. My father's generous patron of the arts, who insisted on playing chaperone tonight. He insisted, Arthur corrected smoothly, stepping into the studio. He kept his hands in his pockets, his eyes scanning the windows, the sightlines, the weak locks on the fire escape. He felt a woman of your stature shouldn't arrive at such a prestigious event unaccompanied, given Silas's unexpected absence. Elizabeth scoffed, tossing the rag onto a workbench. Silas is always unexpectedly absent. Hedge fund managers rarely have time for 16th century oil paintings. And my father is just being paranoid. He thinks New York is a war zone. If you only knew, Arthur thought. He loves you, Arthur said, the lie rolling off his tongue with practiced ease. And I am merely here to ensure your evening is seamless. Elizabeth walked closer to him, her hazel eyes narrowing. She smelled of vanilla and harsh chemicals. You don't look like an art patron, Mr. Jasson. You look like you break jaws for a living. Arthur offered a faint, dangerous smile. I assure you, Miss Caldwell, I am a man of refined tastes. The Caravaggio you are unveiling tonight. The Taking of Christ, is it not? A fascinating study in chiaroscuro. The juxtaposition of divine light against the absolute corruption of the dark. Elizabeth blinked, genuinely surprised. You know your art history. I know darkness, Arthur replied softly. Shall we go? I have a car waiting. You have a fitting for your gown. And I prefer we stay on schedule. The next 3 hours were an exercise in supreme restraint for Arthur. He escorted her to a high-end boutique on Madison Avenue. While Elizabeth disappeared into a dressing room, Arthur sat on a plush velvet sofa, sipping espresso and subtly interrogating the security guards with his eyes. His earpiece crackled. Boss, we got a tail, Leo's voice murmured in his ear. Black SUV, New Jersey plates, been hovering since we left the studio. Arthur lifted his espresso cup, his face a mask of absolute calm. Ricci's men. Don't engage. Let them think we don't notice. We keep them on a leash until the gala. If they make a move in public, they're stupider than I thought. Mr. Jasson? Arthur looked up. The breath hitched in his throat, a completely involuntary reaction that deeply annoyed him. Elizabeth stood before him in a gown of deep emerald silk. It clung to her curves and draped elegantly down to the floor, leaving her shoulders bare. Her wild chestnut hair had been tamed into a sophisticated cascade. She looked like royalty. She looked like a target. Will this suffice for your refined tastes? She asked, a playful smirk touching her lips. It is adequate, Arthur said, standing up. He refused to let her see the impact she had, though you might want to bring a coat. The night air is deceptive, As they walked out to the waiting armored Rolls-Royce, Arthur placed a heavy, warm hand on the small of her back. Elizabeth stiffened slightly at the contact, looking up at him. "Just guiding you to the car, Miss Caldwell," he murmured, his eyes scanning the street. He spotted the black SUV idling halfway down the block. "You're very tense, Mr. Jason," Elizabeth noted as she slid into the leather seats. Arthur climbed in beside her, the door shutting with a heavy, vault-like thud. "I merely take my responsibilities seriously." The Metropolitan Museum of Art was transformed. The Great Hall was bathed in warm, golden light, echoing with the soft strains of a string quartet and the clinking of crystal champagne flutes. The elite of New York society drifted through the ancient artifacts, oblivious to the predators moving among them. Arthur remained exactly half a step behind Elizabeth. To the outside observer, he was a devoted, handsome escort. To the trained eye, he was a human shield. "You haven't touched your champagne," Elizabeth observed, leaning back against the base of an Egyptian statue. The unveiling of her restoration was an hour away, and the adrenaline was making her talkative. "Alcohol dulls the senses," Arthur replied, his eyes tracking a waiter who was walking a little too rigidly, his hand hovering a little too close to the inside of his jacket. "You know, for a man who claims to love art, you haven't looked at a single painting tonight," she challenged, stepping closer to him. The emerald silk brushed against his dark trousers. "You're looking at the exits. You're looking at the catering staff. Who exactly are you, Arthur?" He looked down at her. Her intuition was sharper than he anticipated. "I am a man who prefers the living to the dead, Elizabeth." It was the first time he had used her first name. It felt strange on his tongue, intimate. Before she could question his cryptic response, a voice cut through the murmur of the crowd. "Elizabeth, darling." Arthur shifted his stance instantly, his right hand subtly grazing the opening of his jacket. Approaching them was a tall, excessively groomed man, with slicked-back blonde hair and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Silas Montgomery, the absent fiancé. Elizabeth's face registered shock, followed by a tight, forced smile. "Silas, I thought you were in London closing the biotech merger." "I wrapped it up early. Couldn't miss my beautiful bride-to-be's big night," Silas said, reaching out to kiss her cheek. As he pulled back, his eyes landed on Arthur, and the fake smile faltered for a fraction of a second. "And who is this?" "Arthur Jason," Arthur said, not extending his hand. He stared directly into Silas's eyes, watching the pupils dilate. Silas recognized the name. Every corrupt financier in Manhattan knew the name Jason. "He's a friend of my father's," Elizabeth intervened, sensing the sudden, icy tension between the two men. "He stepped in to escort me when we thought you wouldn't make it." "How generous," Silas managed, visibly swallowing. "Well, Mr. Jason, I can take it from here. I'm afraid my agreement with the senator was to remain by Elizabeth's side for the entire evening," Arthur said, his voice dropping an octave. "It wasn't a statement, it was a threat." Silas forced a laugh. "Don't be ridiculous. I'm her fiancé." He grabbed Elizabeth's arm, a little too tightly. "Come, Elizabeth. The museum director wants to speak with us." Elizabeth winced slightly at the grip. Arthur moved with terrifying speed. His hand shot out, clamping around Silas's wrist like a steel vice. He squeezed, just enough to grind the bone. "The lady is staying here," Arthur whispered, stepping into Silas's personal space. "Arthur, it's fine," Elizabeth said, her voice laced with confusion and a hint of alarm. Just as Silas yanked his arm free, Arthur's earpiece crackled to life. "Boss." The black SUV guys just walked through the East Service entrance, 3 of them, armed, moving toward the Egyptian wing. Arthur's blood went cold. He looked at Silas. Silas wasn't looking at Elizabeth. He was looking nervously toward the East Corridor. He sold her out, Arthur realized with sickening clarity. The hit wasn't just Ricci's men acting on their own. Silas, deep in his own gambling debts, had traded his fiancée to the Ricci family to clear his ledger. "Silas," Arthur said, his voice terrifyingly calm, "walk away, right now, or I will kill you in front of all these people." Silas went pale, took one look at Arthur's dead eyes, and backed away, quickly disappearing into the crowd. "What the hell is wrong with you?" Elizabeth hissed, turning on Arthur. "Your fiancé just tried to deliver you to a kill squad," Arthur stated bluntly, dropping the facade entirely. He grabbed her hand. "We are leaving. Now." "Excuse me?" I am not going anywhere, my unveiling is. Arthur pulled her hard against his chest, silencing her. Listen to me very carefully, Elizabeth. In about 30 seconds, men with suppressed weapons are going to come around that corner to take you hostage, or worse. Your father didn't hire a patron of the arts. He hired the most dangerous man in this city to keep you breathing. Now, walk with me, smile, and do not look back. Elizabeth's eyes widened in horror, the reality of his words crashing into her sheltered world. She looked at his chest, feeling the hard metal of the gun beneath his suit jacket. Who are you? She whispered, trembling. I am your only way out, he said. He led her briskly toward the Temple of Dendor, a massive open room with glass walls overlooking Central Park. It was dimly lit, romantic, and currently empty, perfect for an ambush. As they stepped into the shadows of the ancient sandstone temple, Arthur pushed Elizabeth behind a massive stone pillar. Stay down, he commanded. Footsteps echoed on the marble floor. Two men in catering uniforms, holding silenced submachine guns by their sides, rounded the corner. They didn't even have time to raise their weapons. Arthur stepped from the shadows like a demon. He didn't draw his gun, it would cause too much panic if the suppressor failed to mask the sound perfectly. Instead, he moved with brutal, silent efficiency. He grabbed the first man by the throat and the wrist, twisting sharply. A sickening crack echoed through the stone temple as the man dropped. The second man raised his gun, but Arthur was already inside his guard. He drove a fist into the man's windpipe, followed by a knee to the sternum that shattered ribs. The man collapsed, gasping silently for air, his weapon clattering across the floor. Arthur stood over them, straightening his tie, his breathing barely elevated. He turned back to the pillar. Elizabeth was standing there, her hands over her mouth, her eyes wide with unadulterated terror as she looked at the broken men on the floor, and then at the elegant, terrifying man who had just saved her life. Your father's debt just went up, Arthur said coolly, holding his hand out to her. Shall we continue our evening, Miss Caldwell? The crisp autumn air of Central Park hit Elizabeth like a physical blow as Arthur Cole shoved her through the heavy steel doors of the museum's loading dock. Behind them, the muffled elegance of the Metropolitan Art Gala continued, utterly blind to the violence that had just stained the floor of the Temple of Dendor. Elizabeth stumbled, her emerald gown catching on a discarded wooden pallet, but Arthur's iron grip on her upper arm kept her upright. He wasn't gentle. He was a machine operating on pure tactical efficiency. Get in, Arthur commanded, yanking open the rear door of an armored, matte black Mercedes G-Wagon that had materialized out of the shadows. Leo, his driver, was already behind the wheel, engine purring like a caged beast. Elizabeth scrambled into the back seat, her breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. Arthur slid in beside her, slamming the heavy door shut. The world outside was instantly muted. Go. Take the transverses through the park, then drop south on the West Side Highway. We are going to the Brooklyn facility, Arthur barked, his eyes scanning the rearview mirror. Yes, boss. We have a tail? Leo asked, his hands expertly navigating the heavy vehicle away from the museum. Not yet, but Donato Ricci isn't known for under-resourcing his hits. They'll have eyes on the main avenues. Arthur reached inside his jacket, pulled out the Sig Sauer, and smoothly racked the slide to check the chamber. The metallic clack-clack sounded deafening in the confined space of the SUV. Elizabeth pressed herself against the farthest door, staring at the weapon. Her hands were shaking violently. The adrenaline was beginning to recede, leaving behind a cold, nauseating terror. She had just seen two men systematically broken in a matter of seconds. She had seen her fiancé, Silas, look at her with the cold calculation of a man trading an asset, before walking away to let her die. You're shaking, Arthur stated, his voice devoid of the mocking charm he had used earlier in the studio. He didn't offer comfort, he merely observed a fact. Who are you? Elizabeth managed to choke out, her voice barely a whisper over the hum of the tires. My father, he said. You were a benefactor. A friend. Arthur let out a dry, humorless exhale. He holstered the weapon, turning to look at her in the dim streetlights flashing through the tinted windows. Your father is a desperate man, Elizabeth. He owes my family $3 million, a debt he accrued betting on greyhounds, rigged construction contracts, and the illusion that he could play God in Albany. He didn't hire me. He begged me. He invoked a 40-year-old blood debt to force me to keep you alive tonight. Elizabeth shook her head, her hands flying to her temples. No, no, my father is a United States Senator. He has private security. His security is bought, Arthur interrupted, his tone brutally absolute. Silas is bought. Silas Montgomery owes Donato Ricci $500,000 in bad margin calls. When Ricci found out your father was trying to pay me off and run, he squeezed Silas. Silas traded your location and your vulnerability for a clean slate. Your fiancé sold you to the mob, Elizabeth. The words struck her like physical blows. Elizabeth squeezed her eyes shut, but the tears leaked out anyway, hot and fast. Why would they want me? I just restore paintings. I don't know anything about money or the mob. Leverage, Arthur said simply. If Ricci holds you, your father signs over the waterfront casino zoning rights before he disappears. It was a hostile corporate takeover, executed with submachine guns, and I was the only thing standing in the way. They rode in silence as the Mercedes sped over the Brooklyn Bridge. The glittering skyline of Manhattan, the city Elizabeth thought she knew, looked alien now. It was a grid of territories, hunting grounds, and graveyards. The vehicle descended into the gritty, industrial heart of Dumbo, pulling into a subterranean parking garage beneath a converted warehouse. The steel gates rolled down behind them, sealing them in a concrete bunker. Arthur stepped out and opened her door. We will stay here until Sunday morning. If your father's money clears, his remaining loyal men will extract you. If not, he trailed off, leaving the threat hanging in the damp garage air. He led her into a freight elevator that opened directly into a sprawling, minimalist penthouse. It was devoid of personal touches. Cold concrete floors, exposed steel beams, and floor-to-ceiling bulletproof windows that looked out over the dark waters of the East River. It wasn't a home, it was a fortress. Elizabeth collapsed onto a severe leather sofa, pulling her knees to her chest, the emerald silk of her gown pooling around her like shattered glass. She looked small, shattered, and entirely out of her depth. Arthur walked to a wet bar, poured 2 fingers of amber bourbon into a heavy crystal glass, and walked over to her. He held it out. Drink. It helps with the shock. Elizabeth looked at the glass, then up at his face. The sharp angles of his jaw, the dark, unreadable eyes. He was a monster who had saved her from other monsters. She took the glass with trembling fingers and downed it in one fiery gulp, coughing as the alcohol burned her throat. You said you prefer the living to the dead, Elizabeth whispered, staring at the empty glass. But you looked like you didn't care either way when you broke that man's neck. Arthur took the glass from her hands and set it on the coffee table. He sat on the edge of the chair opposite her, leaning forward. In my world, hesitation is a luxury you pay for with your life. I did what was required. I suggest you adapt to the reality of your situation, Miss Caldwell. The life you thought you had, the people you thought you knew, they are gone. Until Sunday, you are a ghost. And what happens to ghosts when Sunday comes? She asked, her hazel eyes meeting his, a spark of defiance finally piercing through the terror. Arthur held her gaze. For the first time all evening, he felt a flicker of genuine respect for the woman. That, he murmured, depends entirely on whether your father is a man of his word. Saturday morning bled through the bulletproof glass in pale, unforgiving gray light. Arthur had not slept. He had spent the night in the study, a bank of encrypted monitors illuminating his face as he monitored the fallout from the gala. The city was quiet, but the underworld was screaming. At 7 a.m., the heavy steel door of the penthouse unlocked, and Gregory, Arthur's second-in-command, walked in. Gregory was a man built like a brick wall, with a mind like a steel trap. He didn't look happy. Coffee, Arthur demanded without looking away from the monitors. Gregory set a thermos on the desk and unrolled a set of architectural blueprints, pushing a tablet across the desk. We have a problem, boss. Several of them. Arthur finally looked up, his eyes bloodshot but razor-sharp. Report. The hitmen at the Met were indeed Ricci's. But Donato Ricci is spinning the narrative. He's telling the commission that we kidnapped the senator's daughter to extort the casino zoning rights for ourselves. He's calling for blood. Says you broke the treaty by drawing weapons on neutral ground. Arthur scoffed, taking a sip of the bitter black coffee. Donato is a sloppy tactician, but a brilliant liar. What about Henry? Gregory hesitated. Henry Caldwell is gone, boss. Arthur's hand froze halfway to his mouth. Gone? You mean relocated to the Fed's safe house? I mean gone. Gregory corrected grimly. His private plane never logged a flight plan. His offshore accounts? Empty. He didn't route the money to us, Arthur. He liquidated his domestic assets, cleaned out his safety deposit boxes, and vanished. The feds are tearing his townhouse apart as we speak. A cold, heavy silence descended upon the study. Arthur felt the familiar, icy rage pooling in his stomach. Henry hadn't just invoked a blood debt. He had used Arthur as a distraction. He threw his daughter to the wolves, knowing Arthur's presence would buy him the 24 hours he needed to disappear entirely, stiffing both the Jason syndicate and the Ricci family. And Silas Montgomery? Arthur asked, his voice deathly quiet. Found floating in the Hudson an hour ago, Gregory said flatly. Ricci tied up his loose end. Silas failed to deliver the girl, so Ricci made an example out of him. Arthur stood up, pacing the length of the study. $3 million gone, an open war declared by the Ricci family, and a kidnapped civilian sleeping in his guest room. This was a catastrophic failure of intelligence. The lieutenants are gathering at the warehouse, Gregory continued, watching Arthur carefully. Paul and the others. They are advising that we hand the girl over to the feds or leave her somewhere Ricci can find her. She is a massive liability, Arthur. Her father screwed us. We owe her nothing. You protected her for the night, fulfilling the old debt. The contract is over. If we give her to Ricci, he tortures her to find out where Henry went, then kills her, Arthur stated, staring out the window at the churning river. That is Henry's problem. Not ours, Gregory pressed. We are businessmen, Arthur, not white knights. Excuse me. Both men whipped around. Elizabeth stood in the doorway of the study. She was no longer wearing the ruined emerald gown. She had found a pair of black sweatpants and a gray t-shirt in the guest room wardrobe. Her hair was a messy knot, and her face was pale, but her eyes were remarkably clear. She had heard everything. My father ran, she said, her voice devoid of emotion. It was a statement of fact, absorbing the shock with terrifying speed. Arthur looked at her, assessing the damage. He did. He abandoned you to save himself. Elizabeth walked into the room, ignoring the imposing presence of Gregory, and stopped in front of Arthur's desk. And Silas is dead. Yes. She took a slow, deep breath, her hands gripping the edge of the mahogany desk until her knuckles turned white. The illusion of her life had been entirely incinerated in less than 12 hours. She was an orphan of a living father, the widow of a traitorous fiancé, and the prisoner of a mafia boss. So, what is the play, Mr. Jason? Elizabeth asked, her chin lifting defiantly. Do you throw me in the river with Silas, or do you wrap me in a bow for Donato Ricci? Gregory looked at Arthur, waiting for the order. Arthur studied the woman before him. She should be hysterical. She should be catatonic. Instead, she was looking for a strategic angle. The blood of a corrupt politician ran in her veins, after all, but it seemed she had inherited the steel he lacked. Gregory, Arthur said, his eyes never leaving Elizabeth's face. Tell the lieutenants to arm up. We are going to war. Gregory's eyes widened. Arthur, be reasonable. A war over a girl whose father owes us $3 million. It is not about the girl, Arthur snapped, his voice cracking like a whip. Ricci put armed men in a museum with my name on the target list. Ricci spread lies to the commission to justify a land grab. If we back down, if we hand over a civilian who sought our protection under the old laws, the Jason family looks weak. And in this city, weakness is a death sentence. Gregory swallowed hard, nodding once. Understood. I'll make the calls. He turned and left the study, the heavy door clicking shut behind him. Elizabeth stared at Arthur. You're keeping me alive out of pride? I am keeping you alive because you are my only leverage against Donato Ricci, and potentially my only lead on your father, Arthur corrected, sitting back down at his desk. But Gregory is right. You are a liability. Unless you have something of value, Miss Caldwell. Elizabeth's eyes darted to the encrypted monitors, then back to Arthur. You said my father owes you $3 million, plus 20% interest, Arthur amended, and he cleaned out his domestic accounts. But you can't find the offshore routing numbers, she continued, her mind working furiously. He hid them well. My best hackers have hit a firewall. Elizabeth leaned over the desk, invading his space. He could smell the faint trace of vanilla mixed with the scent of fear. 2 months ago, My father brought me a painting, a minor 18th century landscape. He claimed he bought it at an auction and wanted me to clean the varnish before he hung it in his office. Arthur narrowed his eyes, listening intently. When I removed the canvas from the stretcher bars, Elizabeth explained, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, I noticed the backing board was unusually thick. I peeled back a layer of the acidic paper. Beneath it was a microscopic ledger. Hundreds of numbers, routing codes, and shell company names printed in UV ink. Arthur froze. You found his master ledger. I asked him about it, Elizabeth said bitterly. He laughed it off, said it was a novelty piece, an old spy trick from the Cold War he thought was amusing. He made me seal it back up. Where is the painting now? Arthur demanded, the tactical map in his head instantly rewriting itself. It's not in his office, and it's not at the townhouse, Elizabeth said, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across her face. It was the smile of a woman who had nothing left to lose. It's in the high-security climate vault at the Guggenheim. I signed it in under my department's inventory to keep it safe while he moved offices. Ricci can't get to it. The feds don't know it's there. Arthur leaned back in his chair, staring at the art restorer. She held the keys to his $3 million, the blueprint of her father's corruption, and the potential ruin of the Ricci family, all hidden behind a layer of varnish. You're a very dangerous woman, Elizabeth Caldwell, Arthur murmured. I'm learning from the best, she replied. So, do we have a deal, Arthur? I get you the painting, and you burn Donato Ricci to the ground for what he did to me. Arthur stood up, extending his hand across the desk. It wasn't the polite gesture of a patron of the arts. It was the firm, iron pact of the syndicate. We have a deal. The Solomon R. Guggenheim Museum at 2 a.m. was a cavernous, echoing shell of concrete and shadows. Its famous spiral ramp, usually bathed in natural light from the massive skylight, looked like the coil of a sleeping serpent. Arthur Jasson stood in the service alley, dressed in tactical black that swallowed the ambient light of the city. Beside him, Elizabeth wore a dark cashmere sweater and dark jeans, her hair pulled into a tight, no-nonsense braid. She was shivering, though whether from the crisp October wind or the adrenaline coursing through her veins, Arthur couldn't tell. The climate vault is on the sub-basement level, Elizabeth whispered, her breath misting in the air. She held up a sleek, black keycard. This gets us past the service entrance and the first 2 security doors. After that, it's a retinal scan. Mine. And the guards? Gregory asked, materializing from the shadows holding a suppressed Heckler and Koch MP5. 2 at the main desk, 1 doing a roving patrol every 45 minutes, Elizabeth answered instantly. But they don't patrol the sub-basement unless an environmental alarm trips. It's strictly temperature-controlled. Arthur nodded, his dark eyes locked on the heavy steel door of the loading dock. We have a narrow window. Ricci's men are tearing the city apart looking for you. It's only a matter of time before someone realizes your father's last visit was to your laboratory. We move fast, we move quiet, and we do not engage unless absolutely necessary. Elizabeth swiped the keycard, the reader flashed green, and the heavy door clicked open with a muted thud. They slipped inside, the air instantly shifting from cold and damp to dry and unnaturally still. The smell of oil paint, dust, and floor wax hung heavily in the corridors. Arthur took the point, his Sig Sauer drawn and leveled, sweeping the corners with fluid, predatory grace. Elizabeth stayed right behind him, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. They descended the service stairwell in absolute silence. At the bottom, a reinforced titanium door blocked their path. Elizabeth stepped forward, pressing her face to the retinal scanner. A red laser traced her eye. An agonizing 3 seconds passed before the heavy deadbolts retracted. The climate vault was massive, filled with towering metal racks housing thousands of canvases, each meticulously wrapped and cataloged. Row 14, Elizabeth said, her voice barely a breath. She led them down the dimly lit aisles. Section C. View of the Arno, anonymous 18th century landscape. She found the slot, pulling out a modest-sized canvas wrapped in acid-free paper. She laid it flat on a nearby stainless steel inspection table. Her hands, which had been trembling in the alley, were suddenly steady. This was her domain. She produced a small surgical scalpel from her pocket and carefully sliced the tape holding the backing board. With practiced precision, she peeled away the first layer of fibrous paper. Beneath it lay a second sheet, completely blank to the naked eye. It's just paper, Gregory muttered, leaning over the table. It's UV reactive, Elizabeth corrected. She reached up and unclipped a small ultraviolet flashlight from her keychain, a tool she used to check for modern overpainting. She clicked it on. Instantly, the blank paper glowed with thousands of tiny, perfectly printed lines of text. Offshore account routing numbers, shell company names, and transaction dates illuminated the dark room with a ghostly violet hue. $3 million, Arthur murmured, his eyes scanning the ledger. He hid an empire on a piece of cardboard. Arthur, Gregory's voice was suddenly tight, devoid of its usual calm. Arthur turned. Standing at the far end of the aisle, illuminated by the emergency exit signs, were three men. They weren't museum security. They wore heavy leather jackets, and the unmistakable outlines of suppressed weapons were in their hands. Vincent, Donato Ricci's chief enforcer, stepped forward. He had a scarred jaw and dead, reptilian eyes. Well, Vincent rasped, raising his weapon. The boss thought the senator might have left a crumb for his little girl. Step away from the table, Jason. We'll take the ledger, and the girl. Take cover, Arthur ordered Elizabeth, his voice a low, commanding growl. He didn't wait for Vincent to fire. Arthur lunged sideways, kicking the heavy steel inspection table forward. It crashed into the metal storage racks with a deafening screech, throwing the canvas and the ledger to the floor. Gunfire erupted, the silenced puff, puff, puffed of bullets chewing into the concrete walls and priceless artifacts. Elizabeth dropped to the floor, crawling frantically toward the glowing violet paper. Arthur returned fire, a disciplined double tap that caught the closest hitman in the chest, dropping him instantly. Gregory laid down suppressing fire with the MP5, forcing Vincent and the remaining man behind a row of Renaissance portraits. We are pinned! Gregory shouted over the noise. They have the doorway. Elizabeth grabbed the ledger, rolling it into a tight cylinder and shoving it into the inside pocket of her jacket. She looked around the vault, her eyes locked onto a heavy red fire suppression lever on the wall. Halon gas. It would choke the oxygen from the room to protect the paintings from fire, but it would also choke the life out of anyone inside. Arthur! Elizabeth screamed. The ventilation shaft above the racks. Can you reach it? Arthur followed her gaze. A large, grated return air vent sat 10 feet up the wall. Yes, when I pull this lever, you have 10 seconds before the gas knocks you out, she yelled. Boost me up! Arthur didn't question her. He laid down one final volley of cover fire, then sprinted across the aisle. Elizabeth grabbed the red lever and pulled it down with all her weight. Sirens instantly shrieked through the vault. A thick, white, blinding cloud of halon gas began hissing violently from the ceiling vents. Vincent and his man started coughing immediately, their gunfire becoming erratic and wild. Arthur grabbed Elizabeth by the waist, lifting her effortlessly as he stepped onto the edge of the inspection table. She ripped the grate off the wall and scrambled into the aluminum duct. Arthur grabbed the ledge, pulling his heavy frame up just as the gas began to burn his lungs. They crawled through the cramped, dusty ductwork, the sounds of Vincent's men choking and cursing fading beneath them. 10 minutes later, they kicked out a grate and tumbled into an alleyway on 88th Street. Elizabeth lay on the cold asphalt, gasping for the crisp, clean air. Arthur knelt beside her, his chest heaving, his suit covered in dust. He looked at her, his dark eyes filled with a raw, unfamiliar intensity. She reached into her jacket and pulled out the rolled-up ledger, holding it out to him. Your $3 million, Mr. Jason. Arthur didn't take the paper. Instead, he reached out and gently brushed a streak of dirt from her cheek. You are magnificent, Elizabeth. The Onyx Room at the back of the Street Regis was a place where kings were made and empires were dismantled over rare scotch and expensive steaks. Tonight, the heavy oak table was occupied by the heads of the 5 families the commission. Donato Ricci sat at the far end, puffing on a thick cigar, looking entirely too comfortable. He was a man who believed his own lies. Beside him stood his remaining enforcers. The heavy mahogany doors opened, and Arthur Jason walked in. He was impeccably dressed in a midnight blue suit, looking completely unfazed by the fact that he was walking into a room of men who were deciding whether he should live or die. Gregory flanked him, carrying a slim leather briefcase. Arthur, Donato said, a mocking smile on his lips. I'm surprised you showed up. I thought you'd be halfway to Mexico with Caldwell's girl by now. I am not a man who runs, Donato, Arthur said, taking his seat at the opposite end of the table. He looked at the other 4 bosses, older, cautious men who valued stability above all else. And I am not a man who breaks the treaty. Donato has accused me of kidnapping a civilian and firing upon his men on neutral ground. He demands my blood and my territory. You killed 3 of my men at the Met. Donato slammed his fist on the table. You stole the girl to get the casino zoning rights for yourself. I protected a civilian whose father invoked a 40-year-old blood debt. Arthur countered smoothly. A debt owed to my father. Under the old laws, my actions are sanctioned. Donato, however, sent a kill squad into a public museum, risking the exposure of this entire syndicate to cover up his own treason. The room went dead silent. The head of the Lucchese family leaned forward. Treason is a strong word, Arthur. You better have proof. Arthur nodded to Gregory. Gregory opened the briefcase, took out the glowing UV paper, and placed it under a portable blacklight in the center of the table. This, Arthur said, his voice ringing with cold authority, is Henry Caldwell's master ledger. It details every bribe, every rigged contract, and every offshore account the senator managed. So what? Donato sneered, though a bead of sweat suddenly appeared on his forehead. Caldwell was a crook. We all knew that. Look closer at page 4, Arthur commanded. The bosses leaned in. You'll see a series of shell companies in the Caymans, Arthur continued. Companies that Henry Caldwell was using to launder money. But it wasn't his money. It was commission money. $2 million, skimmed directly off the top of the union pension funds over the last 3 years. Donato's face drained of color. That's a lie. Caldwell fabricated that to save his own skin. Caldwell didn't fabricate the routing numbers, Arthur said mercilessly. My hackers traced the endpoints this morning. The money didn't go to Henry. It went to a blind trust in Zurich. A trust registered to your wife's maiden name, Donato. The atmosphere in the room turned instantly lethal. Skimming from the commission was the one unforgivable sin. The other bosses slowly turned to look at Donato Ricci. Their eyes were devoid of mercy. Henry found out you were skimming, Arthur explained to the room. He tried to blackmail you with this ledger. That is why you wanted him dead. That is why you wanted his daughter dead, to ensure she couldn't point us to the evidence. You used the casino zoning laws as a smokescreen to start a war with my family, hoping to wipe me out before I figured it out. It's a setup, Donato screamed, reaching for his jacket. He never made it. Arthur's hand moved with blinding speed. The suppressed Sig Sauer was in his hand and firing before Donato's enforcers could even twitch. A single bullet caught Donato dead center in the forehead. He slumped back in his leather chair, the cigar falling from his fingers to burn a hole in the expensive rug. Arthur kept his gun leveled, his eyes locking with the remaining bosses. The Jasson family reclaims its $3 million from Ricci's seized assets. The rest of his territory belongs to the commission. Are we in agreement? The head of the Lucchese family looked at the dead man, then at the glowing ledger, and finally at Arthur. He nodded slowly. We are in agreement, Arthur. The treaty stands. Arthur holstered his weapon, buttoned his suit jacket, and walked out of the Onyx room without looking back. Downstairs, the black armored Mercedes was idling in the alley. Arthur opened the back door and slid in. Elizabeth was sitting in the corner, staring out at the rain that had just begun to fall over Manhattan. She looked tired, but the terror that had consumed her on Friday night was entirely gone. It had been replaced by something harder, something resilient. Is it done? She asked quietly, not turning her head. It is done, Arthur replied. Donato Ricci is dead. Your father's debt is settled. The commission has accepted the truth. And my father? He is a ghost, Arthur said honestly. With no money and no friends, he will spend the rest of his life looking over his shoulder. He is no longer your concern. Elizabeth finally turned to look at him. The dim streetlights cast sharp shadows across his face. He was a killer, a ruthless syndicate boss, but he was also the only person who had not lied to her, who had not sold her out when it was expedient. So, what happens to me now? She asked. The debt is paid. The contract is over. Do I just go back to restoring paintings? Arthur looked at the woman who had crawled through a ventilation shaft to save his life. A woman who had manipulated the mob with a paintbrush and a scalpel. He realized, with a sudden, jarring clarity, that the silent, sterile life he had built for himself was no longer enough. You can go back to your canvas, Elizabeth, Arthur said, his voice dropping to a low, intimate register. He reached across the seat, his large hand gently capturing hers. But I suspect you will find the world of static art rather dull after this. If you choose to stay, there is always a place for a woman of your particular talents in my world. Elizabeth looked down at his hand holding hers. A slow, dangerous smile curved her lips, matching the one she had given him in the Brooklyn safe house. I suppose, she murmured, her hazel eyes locking onto his, I could learn to appreciate the darker shadows. The underworld operates on a currency far more valuable than cash: favors. When Senator Henry Caldwell slid his daughter's photograph across Arthur Jason's mahogany desk and asked, "Could you accompany my daughter today?" Arthur believed he was merely humoring a dying man's desperate plea to settle an archaic blood debt. He anticipated a tedious evening masquerading as an art patron, a temporary babysitting assignment for a fragile civilian. He was entirely wrong. That single, hesitant request ignited a gang war, exposed a syndicate-wide betrayal, and dismantled his carefully constructed, solitary empire. Elizabeth Caldwell was not a fragile civilian. She was the catalyst that forced Arthur to step out of the shadows and redefine his legacy. In the end, the senator lost his fortune, his family, and his freedom. But he unwittingly gave the Mafia boss the one thing he didn't know he was looking for: an equal.